They told me to sign. Just a medical form, my daughter said, waving the pages like she was late for something that mattered more than me. It's for your checkups, Mom. Nothing complicated. You trust me, right? I did. I always did. That was my mistake. Not the pen, not the paper, not even the little lie in her voice. It was the habit of trust, worn smooth from years of practice, the kind of trust that feels like love until it costs you something real. I remember the sound of that morning as if it were trapped in the kitchen tiles, the blender running, the faint clatter of my granddaughter's cereal spoon, the smell of disinfectant and jasmine. My daughter, Angela, moved through her spotless house with the confidence of someone who never had to doubt the world would bend toward her convenience. She was in her 40s, elegant in that practiced way of women who live on schedules and green juices, her hair perfectly pinned, her tone perfectly polite. Just sign here, Mom, and here too. It's all standard. She smiled the way people do when they want you to cooperate without asking questions. I held the pen like it was an instrument I'd forgotten how to play. The lines were small and dense, words swimming together, transfer, beneficiary, declaration, clause. My English had always been strong enough to teach in, once upon a time, but legal English is a different country. I hesitated, and Angela sighed, the kind of sigh that sounds like a door closing. It's just medical authorization, she repeated, pouring herself coffee. You're always worrying, Mom. You know how hospitals are now. Everything's paperwork. I nodded, though a small pulse of unease pressed against my chest. Still, I signed. It was easier to sign than to explain why I wanted to read. Easier to stay the good mother than to become the difficult one. Later that day, when the mail came, I set the signed papers neatly in an envelope and left them by the door, exactly where she told me to. She kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, already on her phone. You should rest, Mom. I'll handle everything. Handle. That word. It sounded like love until it didn't. That night, I lay awake in the small bedroom at the end of their hallway, the one they'd painted a pale green to calm you down, Mom. I listened to the murmur of their television, their laughter, soft, muffled, belonging to a world that no longer needed me. I thought about the house I'd left behind, the one my late husband and I built 38 years ago, back when we still believed hard work was a kind of prayer. A modest 2-story with white shutters and a peach tree in the yard. Every corner of it carried our fingerprints, his on the tools, mine on the stove knobs, the walls, the tiny gold hook in the hallway where I used to hang his keys. After he died, I stayed there alone for a while. The neighbors said I was brave. I wasn't brave. I was waiting for life to tell me what came next. And life arrived in the shape of my daughter, her voice soft on the phone. Mom, you shouldn't be alone. Move in with us. We'll take care of you. The words were sweet, and I was tired enough to believe them. I sold the car, packed my photo albums, and moved into the guest room that was never really mine. Angela was good at efficiency. Within weeks, she had my bank accounts linked to hers for convenience. My prescriptions delivered automatically, my mail redirected. I told myself it was modern, practical. I told myself she was kind. But sometimes kindness wears a uniform of control, and you don't recognize it until the buttons are already fastened. The week I moved in, I overheard her telling her husband, "She's still independent, thank God, but we should prepare. You know how fast things can change." Prepare. The word tasted like metal. They thought I was old enough to be managed, but not wise enough to notice. I pretended not to. Pretending is easier when you're outnumbered. The kitchen became the center of my silence. I cooked less because Angela didn't like the smell of oil. I stopped using my porcelain cups because they clashed with the aesthetic. I began to ask, before touching anything, even the thermostat. I told myself I was adapting. What I was really doing was disappearing politely. Sometimes I'd stand by the back window and look at their garden, a stretch of manicured perfection, with no room for vegetables, just imported grass that didn't belong to the soil. My late husband, Wei, used to say, "Real roots don't grow in fake ground." I thought about that often, watching the sprinklers spray a rhythm too, even to be natural. Then came the day of the signing. It wasn't even a special day, just a Tuesday. But that's how betrayals happen in real life. Not with thunder, not with announcements, just with the quiet rustle of papers sliding across a kitchen table. Angela's pen was sleek and gold. Mine was borrowed. I can still see her wrist, the smooth skin, the diamond bracelet I helped her buy after her promotion years ago. She was proud then, so proud. "Mom, I couldn't have done it without you." I believed her. I thought success would soften her. I didn't understand that sometimes success hardens love into transaction. After I signed, she folded the papers with quick precision and said, "See? Easy. You always worry too much." Then she added, half to herself, "This will make everything simpler later." Later. The word floated like smoke. I thought of my husband again. He was a quiet man, patient, the kind who fixed things instead of replacing them. When he died, I remember sitting in our kitchen, surrounded by the scent of ginger and rain, promising him I'd take care of Angela. I didn't realize then that love has an expiration date if it's always one-sided. The next morning, I woke early. The house was still, the world gray with that fragile pre-dawn light that makes everything look honest. I walked into the living room and saw the envelope still by the door. For a moment, I almost picked it up, almost tore it open, almost let suspicion save me. But then I heard Angela's footsteps upstairs, her voice calling to her daughter, her life unfolding seamlessly. And I thought, don't be ridiculous. Don't be the paranoid old woman. Don't make trouble. So I left it there. And in that small act of obedience, I signed away not just a house, but a history. Weeks passed before I realized the shift. Tiny changes first. The mail stopped coming in my name. My property tax bill no longer arrived. And when I called the insurance office to update my address, the woman said, "Oh, Mrs. Chen, our records show you're no longer the homeowner." My mouth went dry. "Excuse me?" I asked, and she repeated it, calm, like she was reading the weather. That was the first time the floor beneath me felt less like ground and more like memory. Later that afternoon, I told Angela what had happened. She smiled quickly, too quickly. "Oh, that's because we consolidated the paperwork for you, Mom. Everything's easier now. You don't have to worry about bills." Her voice was smooth, but her eyes flicked away. And that's when I felt it. A small tear in the fabric of our trust. Not big enough to scream through, but enough to see the light of truth seeping in. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and ran my fingers over the calluses on my hands, old remnants of decades spent in kitchens and classrooms, raising a child, paying mortgages, believing that sacrifice was the currency of love. Now, I wasn't sure what I'd bought. I couldn't sleep. The house felt too clean, too quiet, as if it were already preparing to forget me. Down the hall, I heard Angela laughing softly with her husband, their voices blurred into one sound, contentment. I thought of the day she was born, how small she was, how she'd clutched my finger as if I were her whole world. It never occurred to me that one day she would hold that same hand to make it sign its own surrender. And still, I didn't confront her, because confrontation means admitting the truth, and the truth, when it comes from your own child, is unbearable. The next morning, I went outside for a walk. The sky was a washed-out blue, the air faintly metallic from last night's rain. A neighbor waved, one of those casual suburban gestures that mean nothing. "Lovely day," she said. I nodded. I didn't tell her that I no longer knew where I belonged, that the ground beneath my shoes no longer carried my name. As I reached the corner of the street, I paused and looked back at the house, Angela's house now, though she hadn't said it out loud yet. It looked smaller from a distance, though maybe it was just me shrinking, folding inwards under the weight of what I hadn't dared to see. I thought of Way again, of his voice when he'd say, "Always keep a spare key, May. You never know when the lock will change." I had a spare key. It was warm in my pocket, pressed against my palm like a secret. I didn't know it then, but I would carry that key with me long after the lock stopped turning for me. So, that's where it began, not with cruelty, not with anger, but with a simple, practiced word, sign. And I did, because I loved her, because I was tired, because I believed family meant safety. I didn't know yet that love can be forged into a weapon so silent it wounds without sound. And now, sitting here in this apartment that smells faintly of bleach and loneliness, I can still feel the weight of that pen in my hand. I can still hear her voice, calm, almost tender. "It's just a medical form, Mom." But it wasn't. It was the quietest theft of all, the kind that comes dressed as care. Angela said she would drop the envelope at the clinic herself because I shouldn't bother with errands. But the envelope was still on the hall table 3 days later, tucked behind a jar of peppermint candies that weren't mine, so I slipped it into my bag and decided to go, telling her I wanted to stretch my legs and pick up bok choy from the market, which she pretended to support while suggesting I bring my phone, keep my steps under 5,000, and avoid the sun because hydration is everything at your age. And I nodded the way people nod at airport announcements, not because they agree, but because arguing feels like a layover. No one survives, and I walked out into a morning the color of dishwater and found my way to the bus stop, where the bench leaned like a tired shoulder, and the advertisement scolded me about retirement planning with the gentleness of a threat. The community legal clinic was inside the library, pushed past the new books display and the posters for Children's Story Hour, at a folding table where 2 volunteers sorted forms under fluorescent light that hummed with the fatigue of long service, and I stood there for a moment, holding my bag like a stubborn purse of air, before a young woman with short hair and a cardigan asked if she could help, and I said I had a utility question, something about why a bill disappeared, a small thing really, but maybe they could look, and she smiled, not pitying, not hurried, just open in the way I had not seen in my daughter's face for a long time. She wrote my name carefully on a sign-in sheet, Mrs. Chen, as if my name were something valuable that shouldn't be smudged, and she asked if I had any documents, and I said I had an envelope with some medical authorization forms my daughter asked me to sign, and perhaps they were unrelated, but I had been sleeping badly since then, for no good reason I could name, and the young woman guided me to a chair that wobbled with the honesty of old furniture, and called over a supervising attorney, a man with kind wrinkles and a tie patterned with tiny cranes, who greeted me as if I were arriving at a place I was meant to be. He said they could look over the utility issue quickly and then review any other paperwork if I wanted, and I watched his fingers move across the keyboard with practical tenderness as he searched my address and found nothing, no open account, no pending bill, just a note that the account had been closed at the owner's request, which he read twice and then printed, placing the page on the table between us like a mirror I didn't want to look into, and he asked gently whether anyone else handled my mail and household papers, and I said my daughter Angela helped with logistics because the modern world has so many passwords, it sometimes feels like a river you're expected to cross without a bridge. And he nodded like a man who has ferried many strangers on small boats, and then said, we could open the envelope if I felt comfortable, and I felt the familiar impulse to say no, to protect my child even from the truth. But my hand had already found the flap, and the flap had already given way, and the papers lay there face up under the buzzing light, paragraphs stacked like bricks, my signature threading the margins where the page asked me to certify things I could not pronounce. He scanned the first page with the courtly patience of a person refusing to humiliate another person, and then the second page more slowly, tracing a paragraph with his finger as if reading Braille. And then halfway through the third page, his breath tightened by the smallest degree, not a gasp, not even a pause, just a recalibration of air that told me the news had already happened even before he spoke it aloud. Mrs. Chen, he said, lowering his voice not to whisper, but to soften the landing. This isn't medical authorization, and I wanted to laugh because, of course, everything in my life lately had been called something it wasn't. Kindness that was control, help that was erasure, efficiency that was exile. And here it was again dressed in 12-point font. So I waited, and he tapped the paragraph again, as if showing a child where the treasure map turned into a cliff. And he said, this is a grant deed with an attached transfer on death instrument. And then, more carefully, each word placed like a step across a creek. It transfers your house to your daughter. I felt that sentence move through me like cold tea, not dramatic, not even bitter, just the taste of something long steeped and taken for granted. And for a moment I looked at the fluorescent light, the circulation desk, the cluster of teenagers groaning over algebra, as if any of them could confirm that the air had changed. And the attorney kept talking in a voice tuned to the exact pitch of mercy, explaining that the document said the transfer was effective upon death for one part and immediate for another portion related to title correction and survivorship, that it was convoluted in a way that did not accidentally happen, that there were initials in places where consent had been segmented into crumbs and then swept together as proof of desert. And he pointed to my initials, so small and diligent, my handwriting trying to be helpful while agreeing to vanish. He asked when I signed and whether I had read the pages, and the shame that bloomed in me was not the hot kind, but the cool, sticky kind you get when a child spills honey on the table and everyone keeps eating, because what else can you do? And I said my daughter told me they were medical forms and that she was late for the dentist, and the words ran like a faucet that would not turn off. And he did not interrupt, merely adjusted his glasses and placed a small yellow pad beside the papers and wrote a list that looked like a raft. Capacity, undue influence, fraud in the inducement, terms that were both knife and bandage. And he said we could discuss options, that nothing was simple, but not everything was lost, that we could at least understand the exact shape of what had been taken. And I thought of Angela's diamond bracelet and her cool mouth and the way she kissed my cheek without seeing my face. And I felt an ache not in my chest, but behind my breastbone, where memory keeps its tools. He asked if I had the original deed to the house or any proof of payment beyond the mortgage statements, and I said yes. I kept a folder with the first closing documents, the ones from years ago when Wei and I signed under a banker's watchful portrait, and the attorney smiled in the way people smile at photographs of houses that still had porches. and he said to bring everything I had, every scrap, every check carbon, anything with my name printed as owner, because chronology is a language courts still understand, and if there was coercion, we might trace it in the timeline like a shadow where light should have been. And I nodded while the room tilted slightly, my body remembering that it was old, my mind refusing to allow it to sit down. And when the young volunteer brought me water, she set it down with both hands, the way a person places a candle in a wind. The attorney asked a few more questions, not prying so much as trying to carve away fog. Whether my daughter had a power of attorney on file, whether a notary had been present, whether I had met this notary, or whether the stamp had flown to the house like a sparrow no one saw, whether anyone had explained the revocation period, whether the county recorder had sent a notice, and with each question I could hear the answer arriving before my lips shaped it, and the answers all sounded like my daughter's voice saying, "I'll handle it, Mom," as if the word handle were a cradle rather than a vice. He rubbed his forehead once, briefly, then straightened and told me with careful honesty that the form was regular on its face, not a sloppy forgery, but a clean document that would sit comfortably in a clerk's drawer unless someone nudged it, and that the law cared about signatures even when family did not, and that proving deception was possible but uphill. And I thought about hills, about the way Way used to push the grocery cart up the steep block while I carried the eggs like small moons, and how we never broke one because we were not careless, and how I had been careless with something that did not crack so cleanly as an egg. In the corner of the library, a librarian announced the start of story time, and the children gathered with an eagerness that sounded like rain on summer pavement, and for a moment I wanted to sit with them and listen to a book where the villain wore a cape and the problem fit into 20 pages, and the adults learned to apologize before the staples. And then I remembered that adulthood is where apologies are replaced by phrases like, "You misunderstood," and "It's more complicated than that." And I pressed my fingertips to the deed where my name had been rendered ceremonial, a guest at its own table. The attorney said we should make copies, many copies, and that I should keep the originals somewhere safe and separate. And he offered to file a request for assessor's records and a preliminary consultation with a senior law clinic that took cases involving undue influence, and I nodded again, nodding so much I feared my head would loosen, and he asked gently whether I felt safe at home, and I heard the tremor in that question, the way it bridged legal harm and moral harm, and I said yes, because the door locks and the pantry is full, and no one shouts. And then after a moment I said no, because safety is not a stocked fridge and quiet hallways. Safety is a place where your name is not a courtesy. And he wrote something on his pad and slid me a hotline number printed on a card as plain as bread. When we finished, he gathered the copies into a manila folder and wrote my name across it in careful block letters, the way teachers write on the first day of school to show you that your name can fill a line. And he asked if I had someone I trusted who wasn't my daughter, a neighbor or a friend or a cousin, anyone who could walk with me through the next steps. And I thought of a woman from my old street who still sends me photos of her persimmon tree. And I thought of my husband's friend who brings incense to the cemetery every fall. And I thought of how thin my list was, and how that thinness made the air in my lungs feel rationed. And I said I would make a call, and I meant it less as a promise than as a rehearsal for becoming the kind of person who can dial. He shook my hand with two hands, enclosing mine as if it were a small, skeptical bird, and he said, "You are not alone," which I understood as both comfort and instruction. Outside, the sky had cleared in the lazy way of a day that remembers how to be kind after it has already disappointed you, and I stood on the library steps and watched a boy chase a paper airplane across the plaza while his mother laughed, and I wanted to tell them to hold the moment with both hands, to label it carefully, to notarize it even, because the future is full of forms that call themselves other names. And then the bus arrived with its familiar sigh, and I climbed aboard and sat near the back where the seat smelled faintly of oranges and pennies, and I pressed the manila folder against my ribs as if it were not paper but a rib itself. And I told myself I would not cry, because crying is a kind of agreement, and I am not in agreement. When I reached the corner of Angela's street, I did not turn. I kept walking, past the tidy hedges and the blue recycling bins and the ornamental trees that will never bear fruit, and I felt the stiffness in my knees and the rage in my stomach and the strange, precise relief that comes when a fog lifts to reveal a cliff you can finally see. And I said my husband's name under my breath, the way a person tests a bridge before crossing. And I went home by the long way, so I could learn the distance between the place where truth was spoken and the place where I would have to speak it. The weeks that followed passed with the deceptive stillness of deep water. Nothing looked different on the surface. Angela still called me Mom, still left little bowls of sliced fruit on the counter as if I were a guest in a polite hotel, and still spoke in that soft managerial tone that had become her signature, the kind of voice people use when speaking to both subordinates and fragile objects. Yet beneath the smooth routine, something had shifted, and I could feel it in the air that seemed to belong to her now, in the walls that echoed not with family, but with policy. The night I came home from the library, I hid the folder beneath a stack of old winter scarves in my closet and sat for a long time on the edge of the bed, tracing the weave of the blanket, listening to the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, thinking about the strange modern magic by which a single pen stroke could turn 38 years of living into a line item on someone else's balance sheet. I should have confronted her that evening, but confrontation requires a kind of faith that the other person cares enough to hear you, and mine was already dying quietly in the corners of the room. Instead, I tested the borders of my invisibility. I began to notice small exclusions, tiny administrative acts that transform my life into a sequence of permissions. The mailbox key was no longer on the hook by the door, but in her purse. When packages arrived, she opened them herself, saying she was streamlining the clutter. The framed photographs that once stood on my dresser disappeared, replaced by an electronic photo frame that scrolled through carefully selected images of the family. Vacations, birthdays, new achievements, but never one of me before gray hair and wrinkles, never one that showed my husband holding her as a baby, never one that belonged to the life we had before she curated it. I realized the photos were not meant to remember, but to edit. The house itself seemed to obey her mood. She hired a new cleaning service that came every Tuesday morning, and they moved through the rooms with an efficiency that erased not only dust, but identity. My teapot vanished one week, my embroidered cushion another. They probably thought it was old, she said lightly, as if old were a synonym for useless. The scent of bleach lingered for hours afterward, sharp and bright, and I found myself standing by the open window breathing through my sleeve, telling myself the sting in my eyes was just chemical. At night, I began to keep notes, dates, small observations, the kind of diary you write not to publish, but to anchor your sanity. January 9th, Angela called the insurance company from her office phone, told them to list her as main contact. January 17th, her husband mentioned renovations in our house. then corrected himself with a laugh. Your house, Mom, of course. January 23rd. She looked through my dresser drawers, said she was checking for expired medication. The entries were small, almost polite, yet they accumulated like sediment until the shape of what was happening became visible even to my reluctant heart. There were days when I tried to talk myself out of suspicion. I told myself she was busy, that she had a demanding job, 2 children, a mortgage, a husband who traveled constantly, and a mother whose needs, though small, were still an intrusion. I told myself that her distance was exhaustion, not calculation, and that I should be grateful for a roof and meals and the illusion of family dinners where conversation circled like decorative birds that never landed. But the mind, once awakened, refuses sedation, and mine was now fully awake. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I overheard Angela speaking to her husband in the next room. Her voice was low, but not low enough, that confidential whisper that invites eavesdropping by design. She's lucky we're keeping her here, she said. If she moved into assisted living, she'd lose half her benefits. This way, at least the property stays consolidated. There was a pause, a male sigh, then his voice. But what if she changes her mind? Old people can be unpredictable. Her reply came like a gate closing. She won't. She's too proud to admit she signed something she didn't understand. I stood very still, a towel clutched in my hands, and felt the air compress around me. It was not the words themselves that broke me. It was their calmness, the bureaucratic serenity with which they discussed my existence as an asset management strategy. I set the towel down carefully because rage, at my age, must be handled like porcelain. That evening at dinner, Angela was radiant, laughing with her daughter about a school project, correcting her husband's grammar, passing me the steamed fish with that same rehearsed tenderness that could fool any outsider into believing we were close. I watched her mouth move, the small flex of her cheek, and wondered when I had stopped seeing her as my child and started seeing her as a stranger occupying my daughter's body. When she turned to me and asked about my day, I said, "Quiet," and she smiled, relieved that I was still manageable. The next morning, I visited the garden behind the house. The jasmine bushes my husband had planted years ago still grew there, stubborn and fragrant. Angela had wanted to replace them with succulents. Less mess, less maintenance. But I had pleaded sentimentality, and she had relented, though not without a sigh. I knelt by the plants, tracing the curve of the stems, and thought of the lawyer's words. Not everything is lost. Perhaps he meant documents could be fought, signatures contested, but what lingered with me was the smaller truth that not everything inside me was lost either. The jasmine had survived pruning before, so could I. Still, the erosion continued in ways too subtle to name. She began handling my bank statements to simplify taxes. My old phone number was replaced with a new one, on the family plan. When friends from the old neighborhood called, they were told I was resting. One by one, my connections were filtered until only her voice reached me, a single channel controlling both question and answer. Sometimes she would speak to me about the future in the plural. We should think about what's next. We might sell the old house eventually. And I would nod, though the pronoun lodged in my throat like a bone. There was a day when she accompanied me to the doctor and filled out every form before I could uncap the pen. "You don't need to bother, Mom," she said, handwriting brisk and professional. The nurse, mistaking her for my caretaker, addressed her instead of me. I sat there on the exam table, hands folded in my lap, watching the two of them exchange information about my body as if I were a witness rather than a participant. It was then I realized how easily the world colludes with whoever seems more fluent in control. At home, I found myself waking earlier just to have a few unsupervised hours before she descended the stairs with her laptop and her plans. I would make tea in silence, read the newspaper, and feel like a trespasser in my own mornings. One of those dawns, I decided to test something. I opened the front door and stepped out without leaving a note, without my phone, without explanation. I walked to the bus stop and rode to the next town, just to prove to myself that I still existed somewhere outside her design. I bought a cheap scarf from a discount store, blue with tiny white cranes, and wore it home as a secret flag of survival. When I returned, she was waiting by the window, furious in that controlled, managerial way that sounds like patience, but isn't. "Mom, you scared me," she said. "I was about to call the police." I apologized, even though the only person missing was the one she had already erased. After that, her monitoring grew quieter but tighter. She installed a doorbell camera for safety. She began labeling shelves, organizing my things into bins, as if categorizing the remnants of an exhibit. One afternoon, I found a note taped to the refrigerator. "Please don't rearrange items. The kids can't find things." The handwriting was neat, friendly, efficient. I kept the note, folded small, in my diary. It reminded me of the invisible contract we now lived under. Then came the dinner, where she announced, smiling, that they might remodel the downstairs bathroom and convert your room for more flexible use. Her husband added, "Just in case we need a home office or guest space, nothing urgent." I looked at the chandelier above the table, the way its light fractured into hundreds of small, trembling shapes across the wall, and understood that the decision had already been made. I murmured that it sounded practical, and they relaxed, mistaking resignation for consent. That night, I sat by the window, my blue scarf wrapped tight, and thought of Way's voice telling me years ago that losing ground begins with forgetting to stand. The following week, I returned to the library under the pretext of borrowing a book. The young volunteer from before recognized me and smiled. I told her softly that the situation at home was delicate, and she nodded as if the word were enough explanation. She handed me a pamphlet about elder financial abuse, its language clinical yet oddly tender, full of bullet points that mirrored my diary entries so precisely that it felt as though someone had been living in my house taking notes. I read it twice on the bus ride back, each line sharpening into a quiet vow. At home, I hid the pamphlet inside an old cookbook, between the pages for sweet red bean buns. Angela never looked there. Cooking was beneath her version of efficiency. That night, while everyone slept, I opened my diary and wrote a new entry, longer than all the rest combined. I described the smell of bleach, the missing teapot, the surveillance disguised as safety, the laughter through thin walls, and at the end I wrote a single line: "I will not sign anything again." It wasn't defiance yet, just a declaration of existence. Still, I moved carefully. Each morning I played the role expected of me, gentle, grateful, compliant, while memorizing the rhythms of their absence. I noted when they left for work, how long the house stayed empty, which drawer held the property tax receipts. I was not planning revenge. I was preparing memory for the moment someone would ask if I remembered. I intended to remember everything. One evening, as I was watering the jasmine, my granddaughter Lily came outside with a picture book. "Grandma, why do you always touch the flowers?" she asked. I smiled and said, because they remember me even when no one else does." She laughed, not understanding, and handed me a drawing she'd made at school, a house with a tree and 3 stick figures, one taller with gray hair. "That's you," she said proudly, "so you don't forget where you live." I kissed her forehead and whispered a thank you she wouldn't yet understand. Inside the house, I could hear Angela on the phone discussing interest rates, her tone brisk and confident. I stood by the kitchen door, listening to her shape her future with my past, and for the first time in months, I felt something like steadiness return. She believed she had written me out of the story, but she had only pushed me to the margins, and margins, I was beginning to realize, are where revision begins. When I went to bed that night, I took the key from my pocket, the spare from the old house, and placed it beneath my pillow. It was cold, small, useless in a practical sense, but the weight of it steadied my breathing. I fell asleep imagining not revenge, not justice, but clarity, the clean, unflinching kind that dawn brings after a long, dishonest night. The morning I decided to go back to the library felt like every other morning, gray and obedient. The house smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and stale toast, and somewhere upstairs, Angela's voice floated down the hallway, firm and bright, organizing her day before the world had even asked her to. I waited for the familiar sequence of sounds, the shower, the hairdryer, the quick footsteps on the stairs, the perfunctory kiss on my cheek, and the automatic reminder to take your vitamins, Mom. And when the garage door finally closed behind her car, the silence that followed felt like permission. I made a small pot of tea, not the green kind she preferred, but the dark, earthy oolong my husband and I used to drink on quiet Sundays, and poured it into a chipped cup she would have thrown away. The steam smelled like a promise I had almost forgotten I'd made to myself, to stop living as if gratitude were a form of obedience. I wrapped my scarf around my neck, took the manila folder from under the scarves in the closet, and walked out into a morning that no longer belonged to her. At the library, the young volunteer greeted me by name this time, as though we had a standing appointment, and I realized how long it had been since anyone had spoken my name without an agenda attached. The supervising attorney, Mr. Patel, remembered me too. He had the gentle eyes of someone accustomed to hearing people's worst stories told in polite voices. He asked how I had been, and I said, "Still here," which was truer than it sounded. We sat again at the same folding table under the same buzzing lights, but this time I was the one who unfolded the papers and spread them out neatly, as if arranging evidence at a crime scene I had finally accepted as real. He read quietly for a while, making small notes in the margins, and then looked up and asked if I had any documents that proved financial contribution, old checks, tax records, anything showing I had paid for the house. I nodded and handed him the worn envelope I had brought from my drawer. Inside were photocopies of checks from decades ago, my signature still bold and certain, back when my hands didn't tremble. He took each page carefully, scanning them as though they were relics from another era, which in a way they were. "These help," he said. "They tell a story. The law likes stories it can measure." I told him that my daughter said everything she did was to protect me, and he smiled sadly. "People use the word protect when they mean control, Mrs. Chen. It sounds better in daylight." He began to outline possible options. We could file an affidavit of fraud, request a freeze on further transfers, seek mediation. Each term sounded like a mountain in a language I didn't speak, but he explained patiently, translating law into humanity until I began to see a shape in the fog. The truth was simple but sharp. The transfer could be challenged if it was proven that I didn't understand what I had signed or that my daughter had misrepresented it. But understand, he said gently, you would need to stand by that claim, in writing and in court if it came to that. I thought about standing, how heavy my legs felt even on a good day, how strange it would be to speak against the child I had raised with the very strength she now used to manage me. He must have seen hesitation in my eyes because he added, you don't have to decide now. Sometimes just knowing the law recognizes what was done to you is a beginning. After our meeting, I didn't go straight home. I wandered through the streets near the library, letting the city fold around me. The shops were small and shabby, the kind of places Angela would never enter, but they smelled of food and life, no scented candles, no curated playlists. At the corner, a bakery displayed mooncakes dusted with sesame, and for a moment I was transported to another time, when my husband and I had taken Angela there after school for treats, when her laughter had been uncalculated, her face open. I bought one mooncake and ate it standing outside, the crust sweet and crumbling, the filling rich with lotus paste, and as the taste filled my mouth, I felt the faintest spark of rebellion, a reclaiming of something small but mine. When I finally returned home, the house greeted me with the cold precision of a showroom. Angela was still at work. I sat at the kitchen table, the manila folder beside me, and looked around at the polished countertops, the spotless glass, the designer fruit bowl containing 3 identical green apples. The house had no smell, no story, only the hum of appliances and the distant ticking of a clock that didn't care whose time it kept. I realized I didn't want to die here. The thought came so quietly it startled me, not in drama, not in despair, just in clarity. I wanted to die somewhere that still recognized me. Over the next days, I began to take small, deliberate steps toward a kind of freedom that did not announce itself. I went to the community center Mr. Patel had recommended and attended a workshop about senior rights. The room was filled with people who looked like me, older, polite, tired. But when the speaker talked about coercion disguised as care, a collective murmur ran through the crowd, the sound of recognition too late, but still necessary. Afterward, I stayed behind and spoke with a woman named Lillian, who worked part-time, helping seniors manage their paperwork. She was maybe 50, brisk but kind, and when I told her a little of my story, she didn't gasp or pity me. She just said, "They always call it help, don't they?" and handed me a card with her number on it. "If you need witnesses or just someone to read something before you sign, you call me, free of charge." That night, I hid her card in my diary next to the note I had written, "I will not sign anything again." And I slept for the first time without dreaming of contracts and signatures and disappearing ink. The next morning, Angela noticed nothing, which gave me a quiet satisfaction. She poured her smoothie, checked her phone, and left a list of errands for me to help with, as if chores were currency for staying. I nodded, but once she left, I ignored the list and instead took a walk to the park by the river. The air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass, and the sky was streaked with that pale blue that promises change. I sat on a bench and watched children chase bubbles, their laughter high and careless, and I thought how beautiful it was to move without explanation. As the weeks went on, my small secret life expanded. I started volunteering 2 afternoons a week at the community library, shelving returned books and helping children find picture stories. It paid nothing, but it gave me something infinitely more valuable, hours that were mine. I didn't tell Angela. I let her believe I was taking naps or knitting. Sometimes after my shift, I would stop by a tiny tea shop near the bus stop, and the owner, a man with white hair and a faded apron, began to recognize me. He would pour me a cup of jasmine tea. "On the house, for loyalty," he'd say, and we would sit quietly, not talking much. Silence in that place felt different. It wasn't a void. It was rest. Then one afternoon, something shifted again. I came home earlier than usual and found Angela at the dining table surrounded by papers. She didn't hear me at first, and I stood in the doorway, watching her type rapidly, her expression focused, detached. On the screen of her laptop was my name. She was composing an email to her lawyer, something about finalizing the property assessment and clearing the title. My throat tightened. She looked up then, startled, and quickly closed the laptop. "Oh, Mom," she said with a forced smile. "I didn't hear you come in." I told her I had finished my errands early. She nodded, busying herself with the papers, saying it was just some routine follow-up, nothing for me to worry about. Her tone was smooth, but her hands were shaking. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes, not fear of guilt, but fear of losing control. That night, I sat by the window again, watching the shadows of the garden shift in the wind. I thought about what it meant to reclaim something, not always the thing itself, but the power to name it, to tell its story. The law could fight over ownership, but the truth of belonging was mine. I took out my diary and began to write. Not notes this time, but a letter. Not to Angela, not to the court, but to myself. I wrote about the girl I had been, the woman who crossed an ocean with a husband and a baby and a head full of hope. The years of work, the laughter, the arguments, the simple faith that family was a promise, written in the language of care. I wrote until my hand cramped and the paper blurred. When I finished, I signed my name carefully, the same name I had written on that fraudulent document, but this time I knew exactly what I was signing. The next morning, I made a decision. I would meet Mr. Patel again and tell him to proceed, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted record. I wanted something official to exist in the world that said, she was deceived, but she did not stay silent. That afternoon, while Angela was out, I copied my diary entries, my notes, the photos of the old checks, and the contact card from Lillian, and placed them all in the manila folder. As I sealed it, I realized my hands were steady. When the bus pulled up to the stop, the driver recognized me now. "You're becoming a regular," he said with a grin. I smiled back, realizing he knew me more honestly than my own daughter did. At the library, Mr. Patel looked up from his desk and smiled when he saw me. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I was hoping you'd come." I handed him the folder and said simply, "Let's begin." He nodded, his expression both professional and kind. We filled out a declaration that described in the measured language of law what had been done. Each word felt like reclaiming a breath. When it was done, he handed me a copy and said, "Keep this safe. It means you've spoken." I folded it carefully and slipped it into my purse. For the first time in months, I walked out of that library feeling taller, not in height, but in presence, as if the world had returned a small piece of its respect. That evening, when Angela came home, she looked at me across the dinner table and frowned slightly, as if something about me was different. "You look tired," she said. I smiled, sipping my tea. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I'm just finally awake." She didn't know what to do with that. She went back to scrolling through her phone. I looked at the reflection of her face in the dark window behind her, and for the first time, It didn't scare me. It saddened me, yes, but sadness is not the same as fear. It was the midpoint of something larger, something that had quietly begun the moment I stopped confusing peace with silence. When the letter came, it was folded into a crisp white envelope with my name printed in a typeface so sharp it could cut the air. It was waiting on the kitchen counter beside the bowl of artificial lemons that Angela insisted looked fresh all year. I almost mistook it for another bill until I saw the return address, Chamberlain and Associates, Property Law. The sight of it sent a thin current through my chest, not quite fear, not yet anger, just recognition, the way your body knows a storm is coming before the clouds admit it. I stood for a long time with the envelope in my hands, feeling the weight of the paper, knowing it wasn't an invitation, but a declaration. Angela must have left it there on purpose, like a cat leaving a wounded bird on the mat, expecting gratitude for the lesson. I opened it slowly. The words were polite, legal, bloodless. Dear Mrs. Chen, following our previous correspondence regarding the property at 412 Fairway Lane, we kindly request your cooperation in facilitating the smooth transfer of residency. The phrase, smooth transfer, made my mouth dry. It sounded like what people say before moving furniture, not a person's life. It went on to suggest that, in the best interest of all parties, I consider alternative living arrangements, as the property was now legally under Angela's ownership. The tone was almost affectionate, as if the writer believed I would thank him for the courtesy of eviction. When Angela came home that evening, she found me sitting at the table with the letter unfolded before me. For a moment she froze, then recovered, setting down her purse with the exaggerated calm of someone managing a patient. "Oh, Mom," she said, "you weren't supposed to see that yet. I was going to explain." I didn't answer, and she sighed, as though I had already chosen to be unreasonable. "It's not what it looks like. The lawyer just sent a draft. It's procedural. You know how these things are. Paperwork for taxes, liability, all that." Her voice softened, practiced tenderness coating every syllable. "You'll still have a place with us, of course, but we need to make things official for financial clarity." I looked at her and saw, for the first time, the small tremor near her mouth, the flicker of irritation behind her eyes when I didn't respond on cue. "Financial clarity," I repeated slowly, tasting the words like something spoiled. "Whose clarity?" She shifted in her chair, the veneer cracking. "Mom, please don't start this again. You're tired. This is about simplifying our lives. You don't have to understand every detail." There it was, the old insult, disguised as concern. "You don't have to understand." I folded the letter carefully, as if it were fragile, and slid it back into the envelope. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't have to understand. I just have to remember." For the next few days, the air between us grew denser, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Angela was careful, too careful. She brought home flowers, cooked dinners she hadn't made in years, asked about my sleep. It was the choreography of guilt, each gesture rehearsed for an audience she hoped would forgive her before the curtain fell. But I had stopped being the audience. I watched instead, observing the subtle shifts in her tone, the way she flinched when I lingered too long near the phone or the mailbox. She was afraid now, not of me as a person, but of me as a possibility, of what I might still be capable of doing. Then one morning, her husband, Daniel, intercepted me in the hallway. He rarely spoke to me directly. His politeness was usually the kind that happens from a distance. But that day, he cleared his throat and said, "Angela's worried about you, Mrs. Chen. She thinks you've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe it's time to think about an environment better suited for you." His voice was firm, but oiled with feigned kindness. I stared at him until he looked away. "An environment?" I asked. "You mean a home for old people?" He forced a small smile. "A retirement community. They're really quite nice now. Independent living, activities, safety. You'd have more company." I almost laughed. "I have company," I said. "It just doesn't speak to me honestly." He blinked, uncertain whether it was an insult, then mumbled something about lunch meetings and walked away. That night, I dreamed of my old house. In the dream, I was standing at the doorway, holding the spare key, but the lock kept changing shapes. First a circle, then a square, then a spiral of metal that turned endlessly without opening. When I woke, my hand was clenched around the air where the key should have been. I sat in the dark and listened to the house breathing. The walls made small noises, settling. I thought of how many years I had spent creating safety for this child, and how easily she had turned safety into ownership. The following week, another letter arrived, this time directly addressed to me but written in that same sterile prose. It informed me that, following mutual agreement, a phrase that made my stomach twist, a property reassessment would take place within the month, and that my continued residence could complicate the process. The implication was clear. Angela hadn't even bothered to tell me herself this time. She wanted the house ready for whatever came next, renovation, sale, or erasure. I took the letter to Mr. Patel. His expression darkened as he read. "They're moving fast," he said. "She's consolidating the paperwork to finalize her control. But you've already filed your affidavit, so they can't claim total ownership without addressing your complaint." He looked at me kindly but directly. "It might get uglier before it gets better." I nodded. "I'm ready," I said, though the word ready felt like an act of defiance more than truth. He suggested we send a response through his office, a formal notice stating that I contested the transfer and that any attempt to remove me would be considered harassment pending legal review. The phrase, "considered harassment," pleased me. It had weight, a kind of bureaucratic dignity I had been denied for too long. I signed the notice with a steady hand. This time, the signature felt different. It wasn't surrender. It was declaration. When I returned home that evening, Angela was waiting in the living room. Her phone was in her hand, her expression taut. "Mom," she said, "I got a message from Mr. Patel. What are you doing? Are you trying to make things difficult?" I sat down opposite her. "I'm making things clear," I said. "For once." She laughed, a brittle sound that cracked midway. "You don't understand how this looks. You're accusing your own daughter of fraud. Do you know what that means? Do you know what people will think?" I looked at her, at the fear masked as outrage. "Yes," I said. "It means I finally believe myself." Her face hardened. "I was trying to protect you," she said, her favorite line. "From what?" I asked. "From being alone? From your own decisions? From the consequences of mine?" She turned away, busying herself with rearranging papers that didn't need rearranging. "This isn't like you," she muttered. "You've always trusted me." I stood up, my knees trembling but my voice firm. "That was before you taught me not to." From that day forward, the house became a battlefield without noise. She stopped leaving me notes or flowers. The air conditioning stayed too cold, the conversations too brief. At dinner, the silence between bites was thick enough to chew. Even Lily, my granddaughter, began to sense something. She looked from her mother to me with the confusion of a child who can feel tension but doesn't yet have the words to name it. Once, she whispered to me, "Grandma, are you mad at Mommy?" I shook my head and smiled. "No, sweetheart," I said. I'm just remembering how to be myself. A week later, I came home to find my belongings rearranged. My books were boxed, my clothes stacked by the door. Angela appeared behind me, her tone deliberately calm. "Mom, don't panic. I just thought we could start sorting things early, for when you move." I stared at the boxes, years of my life reduced to cardboard geometry, and felt something inside me tilt, not toward anger, but toward clarity. "When I move," I repeated. "And where exactly am I moving?" She hesitated. "There's a place near the lake. Lovely staff, great reviews. You'd have your own suite. It's not permanent, just until everything's settled." I laughed softly, not with humor, but disbelief. "Everything's settled when I say it is." She looked startled, as if the sound of my resistance disrupted her entire logic. "Mom, please," she said. "I'm trying to make this easy for everyone." I met her gaze and said, "You've confused easy with kind." Then I walked past her into my room, closing the door behind me with a calm that surprised us both. That night, she sent Daniel to talk to me, perhaps believing male authority could succeed where guilt had failed. He knocked softly, then entered without waiting for permission, holding a folder. "Angela's not your enemy," he began. "This is just about practicality, the taxes, the upkeep. It's too much for her to manage with everything else." I looked at him, this man who had lived in the house for only 5 years, yet spoke as if he'd built it. "Do you know what it costs to keep a garden alive?" I asked. He frowned, thrown off. "Excuse me?" "It costs patience," I said, "and humility. 2 things this house ran out of when I stopped being the one who watered it." He stared at me for a moment, then muttered something about talking later and left. After they went to bed, I took out my diary and added a new entry. "They are moving to erase me, but I am already elsewhere." It wasn't poetry. It was a fact. My life had already expanded beyond the perimeter of their approval. I had friends now, the librarian, the tea shop owner, Lillian from the community center. They knew pieces of my story, enough to witness it, and witnessing is a kind of salvation. A few days later, I received a call from Mr. Patel. He told me that Angela's lawyer had responded to our notice. "They're offering mediation," he said. "It's a formality, but it buys us time." I agreed to attend. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a neutral office downtown. When I told Angela, her expression flickered between rage and disbelief. "You're really doing this," she said, "dragging our family into court?" "I'm not dragging anyone," I replied. "I'm standing where I belong." The day of the mediation, I wore my blue scarf, the one with the white cranes. I sat across from Angela at a long glass table while the mediator, a woman with tired eyes and a voice like a lullaby, explained the process. Angela's lawyer spoke first, polite but sharp, arguing that everything had been done transparently, that her client had only intended to ensure her mother's well-being. Mr. Patel countered with measured precision, presenting copies of the forms, my statements, the inconsistencies in the dates, the evidence of manipulation. Through it all, I said nothing. I watched Angela instead, the way her fingers tightened around the pen, how her jaw clenched when Mr. Patel mentioned breach of trust. At one point, the mediator asked if we wanted to take a break. Angela nodded eagerly, but I shook my head. "Let's finish," I said. "I'm tired of stopping halfway through my own story." When it was over, nothing was resolved, not legally, but something irreversible had happened in the room. Angela couldn't look at me as we left. In the hallway, she whispered, "You've humiliated me." I turned to her and said, "No, Angela, you've revealed yourself. I just refuse to cover it up this time." That night, the house felt smaller. She barely spoke to me. I heard her on the phone with someone, her voice breaking, saying, "She's not who I thought she was." I almost laughed again. She was right. I wasn't. I was someone she had built, and I had finally stepped out of the frame. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling across the floor. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not victory, not safety, but alignment. The quiet knowing that I was no longer lost inside her version of me. There would still be more to fight, more papers, more words written by strangers, but the tide had turned. And in that turning, I realized that even betrayal, when faced without fear, becomes a kind of freedom. The morning I decided to leave, the light was the color of milk, soft and almost apologetic, as if the sky itself knew something was ending. The decision hadn't come suddenly. It had been ripening quietly inside me for weeks, maybe months, until one night I woke up and realized that staying had become another form of surrender. I wanted to go before they could push me, before my dignity became one more thing negotiated across a table. I didn't want to win anymore. I just wanted to stop living in a house where every kindness had turned into a receipt. The mediation had taught me something vital, that justice and peace are not the same thing, and that one can exist without the other. Mr. Patel had said that the case could take months, maybe longer, but my spirit had already resolved itself. I would leave on my own terms before they could rewrite the ending for me. That morning, Angela was in the kitchen preparing her usual green smoothie, her face half hidden behind the hum of the blender. She looked up briefly when I entered, her expression the careful neutrality of someone managing a delicate truce. "Morning," she said, not unkindly. I answered in kind, poured myself tea, and sat at the table. For a few minutes, we existed in parallel silence. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly. Finally, she spoke without looking at me. "I talked to Daniel last night. We think it's best if you take some time away, just for a while, until things settle." I studied her face. Her tone was rehearsed, the same polished mixture of concern and authority she used in meetings. "I've been thinking the same," I said, and her eyes flickered in surprise. She hadn't expected agreement. "Really?" she asked cautiously. "I thought you'd resist." I smiled. "I'm tired of resisting what's already decided." She seemed relieved, mistaking my composure for defeat. "Good," she said softly. "That's good. I'll help you find a nice place." I didn't answer. I had already found one. After she left for work, I went to my room and opened the closet. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and old perfume. I packed slowly, methodically, folding only what I needed: 2 sweaters, a few blouses, my diary, the blue scarf with the white cranes, and the small framed photo of Wei standing in front of the jasmine bush we had planted our first spring in the old house. I hesitated over the photo, touching the glass. He had been gone 15 years, but in that moment I felt his quiet presence, as though he were waiting just outside the door, patient as always. "I'm ready now," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant ready to leave or ready to live. Before I closed the suitcase, I took the folder Mr. Patel had prepared and slipped it inside the inner pocket. It contained everything: my affidavit, copies of the deed, correspondence, and the latest legal notice confirming that the case was pending review. It was, in a sense, the proof that I existed. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 81 years of breathing, working, raising, and enduring, the only thing that could prove I was real was a stack of paper. Still, I wanted it with me, not in their hands. I left the house quietly, without note or ceremony. The morning air was cold and smelled faintly of rain. The jasmine by the back fence had started to bloom early, small white petals trembling in the breeze. I paused beside them and picked one flower, tucking it into my pocket, a keepsake, but also a witness. As I walked down the street, the houses all looked the same, neat, obedient, detached. I thought of how long it had taken me to understand that comfort and captivity can wear the same face. At the bus stop, I sat with my suitcase on my knees and felt an unfamiliar sensation rising inside me. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter, steadier, relief maybe, or the first taste of autonomy after years of supervised affection. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard and took a seat by the window. As the engine started, I looked back once. Through the glass, the house stood still, dignified and empty, already belonging to someone else's story. I imagined Angela coming home to find my room bare, the drawers empty, but not abandoned, the air still holding the faint trace of jasmine. She would be furious, but beneath that fury would be confusion, maybe even shame. She would have to live with the echo of my absence, which would be louder than any argument I could have given her. The bus carried me across the city toward the senior apartments I had applied for weeks earlier through Lillian's help. The building was modest, brick, 3 stories high, surrounded by stubborn dandelions and the hum of traffic. But when I first visited, something about it felt honest. The walls were chipped, the floors squeaked, but no one pretended it was perfect. When I arrived, the manager, a small woman named Maria, greeted me with a warmth that didn't ask for anything in return. "You're early," she said. "That's good luck." She handed me the keys to Unit 2B and smiled. "Welcome home." The phrase struck me with unexpected force. I hadn't realized how long it had been since anyone had said it without irony. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, 1 window, a narrow kitchen that smelled faintly of lemon and dust. But as I set my suitcase down, I felt the stillness settle around me like a blessing. I opened the window, and the air outside came in carrying the faint sounds of the city, unfiltered, uncurated. For the first time in years, no one was watching me, correcting me, translating my silence into inconvenience. I brewed a cup of tea on the small stove, the kettle whistling shrilly, and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. The tea tasted imperfect, slightly bitter from the tap water, but it was my bitterness now. I drank it slowly, feeling it burn a line of truth through me. The next few days passed in a strange, luminous calm. I unpacked, cleaned, and learned the rhythm of my new life. I bought secondhand furniture from the thrift store down the street, a small wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, a lamp with a dented shade. I pinned the photo of Wei above the bed and placed the jasmine petal beside it, now dry and curled, still fragrant. Each night I wrote in my diary, not as a record of complaint, but as a map of rediscovery. Today I opened my own mail. Today I burned rice, but ate it anyway. Today I didn't apologize once. Then, one afternoon, as I returned from the library, I found a letter waiting in my mailbox. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the postmark made my heart pause. It was from Angela's city. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity, that stubborn survivor of love, wouldn't let me. I took it inside and sat at the table. The letter was brief, handwritten, uneven. "Mom, I came home and you were gone. I don't understand why you would leave like this. You've made things so complicated. The lawyer says the case will drag on for months. I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted to make things easier. Maybe someday you'll see that. Angela." There was no apology, only justification wrapped in guilt. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't cry. There was nothing left in me that wanted to be consoled by her confusion. That evening, I wrote my own letter, not to Angela, but to Lily. I told her about the jasmine, about how her grandfather planted it the year she was born. I told her that kindness is not the same as obedience, that silence can be as dangerous as anger, and that love should never come with a contract. I didn't know if I would ever send it, but writing it made me feel as if the story had finally chosen its next custodian. The final act of closure came unexpectedly. A week later, I met Mr. Patel again at the library. He handed me a copy of a temporary injunction order that prevented Angela from selling or altering the property until the investigation was complete. "It's a small win," he said, smiling, "but it's yours." I thanked him and walked home slowly, the paper folded neatly in my pocket. I thought about victory, not the kind measured in courts, but the quieter kind, the one that simply lets you breathe without permission. That night, I cooked congee and lit a candle by the window. Outside, the city lights shimmered like distant promises, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I took out the key from my old house, the one I'd kept through everything, and placed it on the table. I stared at it for a long time. It no longer held power. It couldn't open any door, but it no longer hurt me either. It had become what memory should be, evidence of where I'd been, not chains tying me to what was lost. Before going to bed, I took one last walk to the courtyard outside the building. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain and cut grass. Somewhere nearby, a radio played a slow, sentimental song in a language I half remembered. I sat on the bench, closed my eyes, and felt the ache in my chest soften. I thought of Angela, not with rage, but with a kind of distant compassion. She had built her life on fear, fear of aging, fear of losing control, fear of being ordinary. In trying to save herself from those fears, she had devoured the one person who once loved her without condition. I couldn't change that, but I could refuse to be the meal any longer. When I returned inside, I wrote one last entry in my diary. I left without noise, without blessing, without regret. What she took was a house. What I kept was the right to wake up where my name still belongs to me. I turned off the light, the candle still flickering faintly in the corner, and lay down. The window was open, the curtain breathing softly with the night wind. Somewhere far away, I imagined the jasmine blooming again, stubborn and white, surviving even in the soil that had forgotten it. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm home," and for the first time, the word didn't hurt. In the months that followed, time softened its edges, and the days began to resemble one another in their quiet, steady rhythm. The noise of the world outside my little apartment became a background hum, something I could choose to listen to or ignore, and I found that I preferred silence, the kind that wasn't enforced by fear, but chosen by will. Every morning I opened the curtains, let the light in, and felt it touch the walls, as if reacquainting itself with me. There was nothing glamorous about my new life, nothing that would impress anyone who measured success by square footage or inheritance papers. Yet each detail, the chipped mug, the window that stuck in damp weather, the kettle that whistled too soon, carried the texture of freedom. I learned to appreciate small imperfections, the way one admires the wrinkles on an honest face. Sometimes I thought about the house I left behind. I wondered if Angela had repainted the walls, if she had finally torn out the jasmine, if she ever sat by the window where I once watched her come home from school. But the wondering no longer hurt. It had become a kind of distant curiosity, like looking at an old photograph and recognizing the people, but not the moment. Mr. Patel kept me informed in brief, efficient updates. The case was ongoing. Her lawyers were cooperative but defensive, the investigation thorough but slow. I listened, nodded, and felt less and less bound to the outcome. The law would do what it could. I had already done what I needed to do. I had walked out of the narrative that kept me small. One afternoon in early spring, a letter arrived, not from the court this time, but from Lily. The handwriting was clumsy, but careful, the way children write when they are trying to impress. Inside was a drawing, a small red house with two figures standing beside it, one tall, one shorter, both smiling under a sky of uneven blue. Beneath it she had written, "I miss you, Grandma. Mommy says you're on vacation, but I think you live in your own house now. When can I visit?" The simplicity of it made my chest ache, not with grief, but with tenderness. She had understood something her mother never could, that living alone was not the same as being alone. I wrote back that very evening, keeping my words light and kind. I told her I had planted a pot of jasmine on my balcony, that I was learning how to cook noodles again without burning them, and that she could visit whenever she wanted. I didn't mention the court or the house or the silence between her mother and me. Children deserve to inherit gentleness, not wounds. That spring, I joined a small group of women at the community center. We met every Wednesday to read stories, exchange recipes, or simply talk about the things our children no longer wanted to hear. There was Maria from the front office, Lillian from the paperwork clinic, and a retired nurse named Evelyn who brought her knitting everywhere like a protective charm. We didn't call it therapy, though that's what it was, a collective stitching of torn edges. One afternoon, during tea, Maria asked us each to share one thing we'd learned after 70. When it was my turn, I said, "That love without respect is a form of imprisonment." The room went still for a moment before Evelyn nodded and said, "And self-respect is the key that unlocks every door." We laughed softly, but it was the kind of laughter that comes from truth, not amusement. On weekends, I volunteered at the library, shelving books, teaching Mandarin to children whose parents wanted them to remember a language they had already begun to forget. The work was simple, repetitive, grounding. Sometimes, when I saw a young mother helping her child spell words, I would feel a small tug of memory, the echo of my own voice teaching Angela to read by candlelight, her little fingers tracing each character with concentration. I didn't push the thought away. I let it pass through me, leaving behind only a quiet gratitude that I had once loved so completely, even if it hadn't saved us. That, too, was part of growing old, understanding that love doesn't have to last forever to be real. One evening, near the end of summer, I received a call from Mr. Patel. His voice was brighter than usual. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "the court reviewed the affidavit. The deed transfer has been flagged for investigation. Your ownership rights are recognized pending full review. It's a strong step in your favor." I thanked him, not because I cared about reclaiming the house, but because it felt like a final confirmation that my voice had left a trace in the official world. After the call, I poured myself a cup of tea and went out onto the balcony. The jasmine was blooming wildly, more fragrant than I had ever managed to coax it before. I thought of Wei then, how he used to say that a plant blooms best when it no longer feels watched. I smiled, realizing that maybe people were the same. In the distance, the city lights flickered like slow fireflies. I thought of Angela again, not with bitterness, but with the kind of forgiveness that doesn't erase the past, only loosens its grip. I didn't know if we would ever speak again. Perhaps years from now, When Lily was grown, she would ask about me, and Angela would tell her a version of the truth softened by time. I hoped so. I didn't need an apology anymore. What I needed was continuity, the assurance that the story would keep moving forward, that my absence would become something teachable rather than shameful. That night, I sat at my small wooden table and began to write the first pages of what would become my memoir. Not a grand one, not meant for publishing, but a letter to the world I had lived through. I wrote about the jasmine, the papers, the signatures, the kitchen light, the silence that almost buried me, and the voice that finally refused to stay quiet. I wrote not to accuse, but to illuminate, because I had learned that many women like me carried the same invisible wounds, the wounds of being handled, managed, gently erased. I wanted them to know there was a way out, even if it meant leaving everything behind. When I finished writing that night, I looked around my small apartment. It was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of tea and ink. Outside, the rain had begun, light and steady, washing the street clean. I felt a strange calm settle over me, as if the world had finally exhaled with me. I closed the notebook and whispered to the empty room, "It's done." Not the story. Life rarely ties itself neatly, but the part that had defined my pain. What remained was not loss, but space. Space to live, to rest, to be simply myself again. The next morning, when I went out for groceries, an elderly neighbor I'd only seen in passing stopped me by the gate. "You always look peaceful," she said. "What's your secret?" I smiled and thought for a moment before answering. "I stopped mistaking silence for peace," I said. She nodded as if she understood, and we went our separate ways. That night, as I watered the jasmine, I caught sight of a single bud opening under the porch light. It was small, perfect, defiant. I thought of all the women who had been told to be quiet, to be grateful, to sign without reading, and I wanted to tell them what I had learned too late, but not too late to matter, that sometimes survival looks nothing like victory. It looks like a small apartment, a chipped cup, a name that still belongs to you. I went to bed with the window open, listening to the rain fade into stillness. In the distance, a child laughed, perhaps Lily, perhaps someone else's daughter, and the sound threaded through the night like a promise. I closed my eyes and said softly into the dark, "For every woman who has been signed away, may she one day sign her own return." And then I slept, not as a mother betrayed, but as a woman who had finally come home to herself,